May 15, 1944, the rolling hills of Normandy, France. At precisely 0600 hours, beneath a sky bruised with pre-dawn purple, a lone American observation aircraft circled at 4,000 feet above a narrow country road. The pilot, Captain James Whitmore of the 9th Air Force, believed he was conducting a routine reconnaissance mission. He expected to spot perhaps a supply convoy, maybe a few scattered German vehicles retreating from the coast. He could not have been more wrong about what the next 10 minutes would reveal. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Captain Whitmore was about to witness would become one of the most unconventional engagements of the entire European campaign, where ancient wisdom wielded by a Native American pilot would dismantle the pride of German armored engineering in less time than it takes to brew a pot of coffee. The morning had begun unremarkably for Whitmore. He had flown 23 missions over occupied France, each one blending into the next with the monotonous rhythm of patrol routes and radio checks. His aircraft, a Piper L-4 Grasshopper, was affectionately called an Apache by its crews, though officially designated as an observation plane. It was a fabric-covered liaison aircraft with a maximum speed of just 85 miles per hour, armed with nothing more than a pair of binoculars and a radio. The Apache had a ceiling of 9,500 feet and a range of 220 miles, powered by a single Continental engine producing just 65 horsepower. Against the technology rolling beneath him that morning, it was hopelessly, laughably outmatched, or so anyone would have assumed. James Whitmore was not just any pilot. Born on the Fort Apache reservation in Arizona, he had grown up listening to his grandfather's stories about using polished metal and reflected sunlight to communicate across vast desert distances. His grandfather, a scout in the late 1800s, had taught him how the Apache used mirrors not just for signaling, but for disorienting enemies, for creating confusion, for making one warrior seem like many. Young James had learned to read the flashes, to understand their language, to make light itself a weapon. When he enlisted in 1942, he never imagined these childhood lessons would become relevant in mechanized warfare. But on this particular morning, as he descended to 2,000 feet to get a better view of the road below, those lessons came flooding back. Through his binoculars, Whitmore spotted them, a column of Tiger tanks emerging from a tree line, moving in tight formation toward a small French village called Villers-Bocage. He counted 15 of them, 15 Tiger Ones, each weighing 56 tons, each armed with the infamous 88mm gun that could punch through any Allied armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Their frontal armor was 100mm thick, effectively impervious to most American and British weapons. They moved with the confidence of machines that knew they were invincible, their commanders probably discussing breakfast and how long it would take to sweep aside whatever opposition awaited them in the village. Whitmore's blood ran cold. He knew what 15 Tigers could do. He had seen the aftermath at Kasserine Pass, had flown over the burned-out husks of Sherman tanks in Sicily. Each Tiger carried 92 rounds of ammunition and could fire with devastating accuracy while moving. Their crews were veterans, trained for months before being allowed to take command of these behemoths. The German military leadership at the time had invested enormous resources in these machines, each one representing over 300,000 Reichsmarks and countless engineering hours. In Villers-Bocage, Whitmore knew there was a company of British infantry and perhaps 3 or 4 Cromwell tanks. The Cromwell's 57mm gun could barely scratch a Tiger's paint at any reasonable range. The infantry had no anti-tank weapons capable of stopping such an assault. They were about to be annihilated, and he was helpless to prevent it in his unarmed observation plane. Or was he? Whitmore banked the Apache sharply, his mind racing. He clicked his radio, trying to raise any friendly armor or artillery in the area, but got only static. The Tigers were now just 4 miles from the village, moving at their maximum road speed of 23 miles per hour. He had maybe 10 minutes, perhaps 12 at most. His fuel gauge showed half empty. His orders were to observe and report, nothing more. Engaging the enemy was not just outside his mission parameters. It was impossible. He had no weapons. But he had the sun, and he had his grandfather's lessons. The sky had cleared as dawn broke fully. and the morning sun now hung low on the eastern horizon, brilliant and blinding. Whitmore reached into his flight bag and pulled out his signal mirror, standard issue for downed pilots to attract rescue aircraft. It was roughly 4 inches square, made of polished steel with a sighting hole in the center. His grandfather would have laughed at how crude it was compared to the mirrors Apache scouts had carried, but it would have to do. He also pulled out his aviator sunglasses, the Ray-Ban model that had just been issued to Air Force pilots the previous year. Their lenses were specially designed to reduce glare. He held them up to the sunlight, examining them. Then he took out his compass, his metal canteen, even the chromium-plated buckle from his spare belt. Anything reflective, anything that could catch and redirect light. What happened next would be debated in military academies for decades afterward. Whitmore brought the Apache down to 800 feet, low enough to be clearly visible to the tank crews, high enough to stay out of range of their machine guns. He positioned himself directly between the sun and the lead Tiger, matching its speed and course. Then, with hands steady from years of practice, he began to flash his signal mirror. The first flash caught the lead tank commander directly in the eyes. Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann of the 501st Heavy Tank Battalion had been scanning the sky, but lazily. He expected no real threat from Allied aircraft this early in the morning, certainly not from a single observation plane that looked like it was made of paper and string. When the brilliant flash struck his eyes, his first instinct was to look away. Then it came again, and again. Not random flashes, but a deliberate pulsing rhythm that seemed to follow him no matter which way he turned his head. Whitmore was using a technique his grandfather called the dancing light. By making tiny adjustments to the mirror angle, he could keep the reflection locked onto a target even as both he and the target moved. To Hartmann, it felt like being pursued by a searchlight, except this light came from the sun itself and was impossible to escape. Inside the tank, Hartmann shouted orders to his driver to change course, trying to get out of the blinding glare. The driver, unable to see the road clearly through his vision port, with the light flashing constantly, swerved left. The Tiger's commander, frustrated and temporarily blinded, did not notice they were veering off the road until the right track caught the soft earth of the embankment. 56 tons at 23 miles per hour does not stop quickly or turn easily. The Tiger slewed sideways, its track digging a furrow through the Norman clay. It came to rest at a 30-degree angle, blocking the narrow road completely. The second Tiger, following close behind, had no time to react. Its commander, Unteroffizier Klaus Weber, had been watching the strange dancing light show ahead with bemusement, not realizing what was happening until it was too late. He screamed into his intercom for his driver to brake, but momentum and weight betrayed them. The second Tiger plowed into the first with a grinding crash of metal that could be heard in Villers-Bocage, still 3 miles away. Whitmore was already moving to his next target. He had multiple mirrors now, holding his signal mirror in his right hand, his sunglasses in his left, adjusting them independently to create 2 separate beams of reflected light. To the German tank crews, it looked like multiple aircraft were coordinating an attack. The third and fourth Tigers, trying to maneuver around the collision ahead, suddenly found themselves targeted by these impossible beams of light that seemed to anticipate their every move. What the Germans did not understand was that Whitmore was not just flashing random light. He was using the same technique Apache scouts had used to communicate. By varying the duration and intensity of the flashes, by directing them at specific parts of the tank, he was creating the illusion of targeting. The German commanders, trained to respond to being illuminated by enemy optics, instinctively assumed they were being ranged by anti-tank guns. Their training took over, and they began evasive maneuvers. On a narrow French country road, with limited visibility and heavy machines following close behind, evasive maneuvers meant chaos. The third Tiger reversed hard, its driver panic steering, convinced they were about to be struck by an unseen gun crew. It backed directly into the fourth tank, which was trying to push forward past the obstruction. Both vehicles locked tracks, their drivers revving engines in opposite directions, digging themselves deeper into immobility. Whitmore circled, sweating now despite the cold air rushing through the open cockpit. His arms ached from holding the mirrors steady. The Apache bucked in the morning turbulence. making it harder to maintain the precise angles needed. But his grandfather had trained him for this, had made him practice for hours under the Arizona sun until he could maintain a reflection on a moving rabbit at 200 yards. The 5th through 7th Tigers had stopped now, their commanders emerging from their hatches to assess the disaster unfolding ahead. This was the critical moment. Whitmore took his canteen, his compass, and his belt buckle, and began creating a pattern of reflections across all 3 tanks simultaneously, moving the mirrors in a coordinated dance that his grandfather had called the Swarm of Stars. To the German commanders standing in their hatches, what they saw was impossible. Multiple points of light, flashing in sequence, creating the impression of numerous aircraft, or perhaps even ground-based signals for artillery. They had been trained that being illuminated meant being targeted. Their doctrine was clear: when targeted, take cover and return fire or evade. But these were tank commanders, and their pride was stronger than their training. Rather than button up and continue forward, they began trying to spot the source of the lights, their gunners traversing turrets back and forth, searching for targets. The 5th Tigers gunner, eager and young, spotted what he thought was an artillery position on a distant hill, actually just a barn with a reflective metal roof catching the sunrise. He fired. The 88mm gun roared, the massive recoil rocking the 56-ton tank backward on its suspension. The shot missed the barn by 400 yards, but struck a stone wall that collapsed across the road. The 8th Tiger, accelerating to get past the confusion, did not see the fallen stone until too late. It struck the rubble at full speed, throwing track. The driver, a veteran named Schiffer, fought the controls as the tank slewed wildly, its right side now without traction. It careened into a drainage ditch, tilting 30 degrees and effectively immobilizing itself. Whitmore continued his dance in the sky, now incorporating movements of his entire aircraft. He would catch the sun with his wing, momentarily blocking the light, then reveal it again, creating a pulsing effect. He flew in tight circles, spirals, and figure eights, each maneuver timed to keep multiple tanks illuminated simultaneously. His fuel was running low. He had maybe 3 minutes of flying time left before he would need to break off and head for base. But 3 minutes was enough. The 9th through 12th Tigers, still mobile and increasingly frustrated, began firing at shadows. One commander swore he saw a glint of optics in a tree line and ordered his gunner to engage. The shot exploded against hardwood, sending splinters and shrapnel in every direction, but no enemy was there. Another tank fired at what its commander thought was a disguised anti-tank position, actually a farmer's overturned cart with a metal wheel reflecting sunlight. The ammunition they wasted in these 3 minutes would later be calculated at 37 rounds of 88mm ammunition, each round costing the German military approximately 45 Reichsmarks and representing irreplaceable supplies that could not be easily resupplied. The 13th Tiger made the fatal mistake of trying to push through the blocked road by climbing over the embankment. Its commander, Hauptmann Dieter Kohl, had had enough of this madness. He ordered his driver to go off-road to bypass the entire mess and continue to the objective. The driver complied, but the soft Norman soil, still damp from recent rain, could not support 56 tons. The Tiger sank to its hull, both tracks spinning uselessly, throwing mud 20 feet into the air. The 14th and 15th tanks, the last mobile units in the column, finally made the decision to reverse out of the kill zone. But reversing a Tiger tank at any speed was difficult, and reversing while being strobed with reflected light that made it impossible to see clearly was nearly impossible. The 14th tank backed into a tree, damaging its engine deck. The 15th successfully reversed 300 yards before its engine overheated from the strain, a common problem with the Tiger's Maybach engine when operated at high RPM for extended periods, without proper cooling time. 10 minutes after Whitmore had begun his attack, all 15 Tigers were effectively combat ineffective. Not one of them had been struck by a bullet, a shell, or any conventional weapon. Not one Allied soldier had engaged them directly. They had been defeated by sunlight, mirrors, and the tactical wisdom of an Apache grandfather passed down through generations. Whitmore climbed back to altitude, his hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. He checked his fuel gauge, nearly empty. He had just enough to make it back to base. As he turned south, he looked back at the scene below. The road was blocked for at least 2 miles. German recovery vehicles would need hours to untangle the mess, and by then, British reinforcements would have reached Villers-Bocage. The 15 Tigers that were supposed to spearhead an assault had instead become an obstacle to their own forces. When Whitmore landed at the airstrip, his commanding officer initially did not believe his report. It was only when reconnaissance photos came back showing the tangled column of immobilized Tigers that anyone took him seriously. Even then, many assumed he had simply observed the aftermath of an artillery strike or perhaps a successful ambush by hidden anti-tank guns. It was not until captured German tank commanders were interrogated 3 weeks later that the truth emerged. Oberleutnant Hartmann, recovered from a field hospital where he was being treated for exhaustion and temporary vision problems, described the attack in vivid detail. His interrogator, a British intelligence officer named Phillips, initially thought Hartmann was suffering from combat stress, or perhaps making excuses for his failure. But when 2 other captured tank commanders told identical stories about the small observation plane with its impossible lights, Phillips began to investigate further. The interrogation transcripts, still preserved in British military archives, record Hartmann saying, "It was like fighting the sun itself. Everywhere we turned, the light found us. Our training told us we were being targeted by many weapons, but we never saw a single gun fired at us. We defeated ourselves trying to escape light." Whitmore was quietly awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation read simply, "For exceptional initiative and ingenuity in aerial observation," with no mention of the actual engagement. The full story was classified, partly because no one in the command structure wanted to admit that 15 of the most feared tanks in the German arsenal had been neutralized by mirrors, and partly because they wanted to keep the technique secret in case it could be replicated elsewhere. But Whitmore never used it again. When fellow pilots asked him to teach them the mirror technique, he tried, but discovered that it required not just knowledge, but a lifetime of practice, a kind of intuition about light and movement that could not be quickly taught. What his grandfather had spent years drilling into him as a child could not be transferred in a few training sessions. The Villers-Bocage incident, as it became known in classified after-action reports, had broader implications beyond the immediate tactical victory. The German military leadership began implementing new procedures for armored columns, including wider spacing between vehicles, increased infantry screening, and protocols for maintaining formation even when under unusual attack. These procedural changes, designed to prevent a repeat of the mirror incident, inadvertently made their armor formations less flexible and slower to respond to conventional threats. American military analysts who were eventually briefed on the incident spent considerable time trying to understand how a pre-industrial technique had proven so effective against modern armored warfare. Their conclusion, buried in a 1946 report that remained classified until 1983, was that technological superiority could create psychological vulnerabilities. The German tank crews were so accustomed to being the superior force, so confident in their invincibility, that they had no protocol for dealing with an attack that did not fit their understanding of modern warfare. The report noted, "The enemy's reliance on technical superiority and rigid tactical doctrine made them vulnerable to unconventional approaches that exploited psychological rather than physical weaknesses." Captain Whitmore's success was not despite the primitive nature of his method, but because of it. The Tiger crews expected artillery, aircraft bombs, or anti-tank guns. They had no framework for responding to directed sunlight. After the conflict ended, Whitmore returned to Arizona. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, but he did return to the Fort Apache reservation and spent time with his grandfather, who was then in his 80s. According to Whitmore's daughter, who shared the story years later, his grandfather laughed when he heard what James had done. "We have been using light as a weapon since before there were words for it," the old man said. "I am glad someone remembered." The technique was never officially adopted by the United States military. The specific circumstances that allowed it to work at Villers-Bocage were too rare to replicate. Clear skies, low sun angle, narrow roads with limited maneuvering room, and a pilot with very specific cultural knowledge and years of specialized training. Military planners concluded that while remarkable, it was not a scalable tactic. But the broader lesson was not lost. The success at Villers-Bocage influenced thinking about unconventional warfare and the importance of cultural diversity in military forces. If a Native American pilot could leverage traditional knowledge to achieve a stunning tactical victory, what other valuable perspectives and techniques existed within America's diverse population that conventional military thinking was overlooking? This question would shape recruitment and training policies for decades to come, though few people ever knew that the catalyst was a pilot with a handful of mirrors and the wisdom of his grandfather. The 15 Tigers involved in the Villers-Bocage incident had varying fates. 3 were eventually recovered and returned to service after significant repairs. 5 were deemed too damaged or too difficult to extract and were abandoned when German forces withdrew from the area. 7 were captured intact by British forces and used for technical intelligence assessment. The captured tanks provided valuable information about German engineering that influenced Allied tank development in the final year of the conflict. As for Captain James Whitmore, he flew 63 more missions before the conflict's end, but none as memorable or as effective as his 10 minutes over Villers-Bocage. He was promoted to major and offered a permanent commission in the newly formed United States Air Force after the conflict, but declined. He returned to Arizona, where he worked as a civilian flight instructor and spent his weekends teaching Native American youth about aviation and traditional skills. In 1978, a young military historian researching unusual tactics of the Second World War discovered a brief mention of the Villers-Bocage incident in declassified documents. He tracked down Whitmore, then in his late 50s, and asked for an interview. Whitmore agreed, on the condition that any published account emphasized that what he did was not his own innovation, but the application of knowledge that had existed in Apache culture for generations. The historian's article, published in a specialized military journal in 1980, finally brought the story to light. It attracted attention from both military analysts and cultural anthropologists, who saw in it a powerful example of how traditional knowledge could remain relevant even in the most modern contexts. Several universities developed case studies around the incident for their programs in military strategy and cultural studies. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. In 1985, the Apache Nation held a ceremony honoring Whitmore and, more broadly, acknowledging the contribution of Native American service members to the military efforts during the global conflict of the 1940s. During the ceremony, an elder spoke about how Whitmore's actions had demonstrated that their traditional ways of warfare and survival were not primitive or obsolete, but simply different, and in the right circumstances, profoundly effective. Whitmore passed away in 1992 at the age of 69. His obituary in the local Arizona paper mentioned his distinguished flying cross, but did not detail the circumstances under which it was earned. His family kept his signal mirror, sunglasses, and other items from that day in May 1944. They are now part of a private collection, occasionally loaned to museums for exhibits on Native American military service. The tactical principles demonstrated at Villers-Bocage, disorientation through light manipulation, exploitation of rigid doctrine, and psychological disruption of superior forces, have been studied in military academies worldwide. While the specific technique of using mirrors against tanks never saw widespread adoption, the underlying concepts influenced development of laser dazzlers, optical countermeasures, and other non-lethal weapons systems designed to disorient rather than destroy. In 2003, the United States Air Force Academy added a brief discussion of the Villers-Bocage incident to its curriculum on innovation in warfare. Cadets study it not as a template to be copied, but as an example of how effectiveness in operations often comes from the ability to think beyond conventional solutions and to recognize that technological sophistication is not the only form of military advantage. The Apache L-4 observation plane that Whitmore flew that day, tail number 43278, survived the conflict and was eventually sold as surplus. It passed through several private owners before being acquired by a military aviation museum in California in 1973. The museum staff did not initially know the aircraft's history until a researcher cross-referenced its tail number with declassified mission logs. Today, it is displayed with a placard describing the Villers-Bocage incident, and a replica of the signal mirror hangs in the cockpit. The narrow road in Normandy, where 15 Tigers came to grief, is still there, though it has been paved and widened over the years. The French commune of Villers-Bocage erected a small memorial in 1994 on the 50th anniversary of the events. The memorial mentions the unusual circumstances of the engagement without going into full detail, noting simply that the town was saved by innovative aerial tactics. Local historians know the full story, and occasionally tourists interested in unusual aspects of the Normandy campaign visit to see where the incident occurred. The broader historical significance of Villers-Bocage lies not in the tactical outcome, though that was significant enough, but in what it revealed about the nature of warfare itself. For all the focus on technology, production capacity, and industrial might that characterized the global conflict of the 1940s, success ultimately depended on human ingenuity, adaptability, and the ability to recognize opportunities that fell outside standard operational thinking. The German Tiger tank represented the pinnacle of armored warfare technology in 1944. Each vehicle embodied thousands of engineering hours, massive industrial investment, and sophisticated tactical doctrine. Yet 15 of them were rendered combat ineffective by a pilot in a fabric-covered observation plane using tools that had existed for centuries. This paradox captured something essential about the nature of that conflict, and indeed, about the limitations of relying solely on technological superiority. In the decades since, military theorists have returned repeatedly to the Villers-Bocage incident as a cautionary tale about assumptions. The German commanders assumed their technical superiority made them invulnerable to anything an unarmed observation plane could do. That assumption, more than any tactical error, led to their defeat. They were prepared for every conventional threat, but had no response to an unconventional one that exploited their own training against them. James Whitmore understood something that morning that transcended military doctrine: that the most effective weapon is often the one your enemy does not expect and cannot counter, because it falls outside their framework for understanding the battle space. His grandfather's lessons about using light as a tool of warfare had seemed like interesting cultural history, stories from a different era. In 10 minutes over Normandy, they proved to be tactically decisive wisdom that changed the course of a military engagement and saved British lives in Villers-Bocage. The story of how one Apache's ancient mirror trick neutralized 15 Tiger tanks in 10 minutes remains one of the most unusual engagements of the entire European campaign. It stands as a testament to the enduring value of traditional knowledge, the importance of cultural diversity in military forces, and the reality that innovation in warfare does not always mean newer technology, but sometimes means remembering older wisdom. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.